Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. Santam Sanghera in conversation with Yasmin Khan. A session that explores the reality and legacy of the British Empire. Satnam's latest book, Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain, is a brilliant commentary on the painful history large parts of the world share. His narrative focuses on the importance of accepting Britain's imperial past in order to understand its present and future. In conversation with academic and writer Yasmin Khan, Sangam Sanghera explores why the existence of the British Empire is often forgotten in modern Britain and underscores the importance of confronting a deeply troubled past. Can I please invite both of you on stage?
So I think a lot of people here will already be familiar with Empireland. I'm guessing that a lot of people may have read it or seen it, but this is Empireland, Satnam Sanghera's amazing tour de force, which has just had this incredible life, hasn't it? It feels like a campaign almost.
No,
and I saw something
amazing.
where your publisher had actually said, it's more than a book. It is a kind of campaign because you've had the TV documentaries, they've gone alongside it on Channel 4, had... schools are getting copies of the book. So, is that how it feels to you? Do you feel like you're campaigning with this?
No, it does feel as much of a campaign as a book. But I didn't write it like that. I wrote it just for myself because I knew very little about British imperialism. And it was accidentally timely. You can't plan these things, unfortunately, because I didn't know Black Lives Matter was going to happen, which has created a massive global interest in colonialism. But it's being taught already, and it's good having success when you're older because you appreciate it. And I realised that that's not a normal thing. People don't write a book and it's not immediately being taught. And I've learnt to enjoy these things.
But I think it's a credit to you because it's about the way that it's written, because it's about your journey, but also a very compelling, detailed, nuanced history of the British Empire. So we get both. We get your own journey through finding out about this and all the kind of humorous aspects to that, but also that really kind of solid history that people seem to have been crying out for.
I think what I've realised is that a lot of history books, present company accepted, are written for historians. And I think there's a whole world of people who wouldn't normally pick up a history book. Or when they do, they're confused. And I'm writing a sequel, and I'm picking up history books, and I regularly don't understand what they're talking about. They assume a lot of knowledge. So I guess it's useful to write an adult history book where you explain things.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that, actually, because it does feel like, you're assiduous in crediting all the historians who've written sort of tiny, narrow monographs about every single aspect of Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia. But it does feel like there's a disjuncture between popular understanding of empire, with some exceptions also. Obviously at Jaipur we see some of those people who managed to communicate those histories, but it feels like there's a disjuncture between popular understanding and then what's been going on in universities and among historians.
I think academics, again, present company accepted, aren't particularly good at explaining what they do to non-academics, and maybe they're not motivated to, because that's not the way their success is measured. Also, I think there's a disconnect between older people and younger people when it comes to this subject in particular. I feel like young people are fascinated with colonialism, and it's the history they're most interested in, and there's not actually that much material available for them. So they have to look elsewhere. So there's hugely popular Instagram accounts about colonialism and brown history, and probably not a corresponding number of books.
So let's get into your journey into this, because one thing that really stood out to me in the book was when you say, I read Edward Said's Orientalism. It was published in 1978. And then you were like, it was like a gut punch. And I've suddenly, you have the kind of zeal of a convert almost, that you've discovered all this history of Orientalism and of empire that's been out there. It feels like you've been on a journey.
Yeah,
to
definitely.
Discover all this.
It's quite shocking that I was 42 before. I bet you lots of people in the room will probably know who Edward Said is, but I didn't. I didn't know that. And actually, You know, one of the books I studied at school for A-level was Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, and I hated it because I thought it was boring and it said nothing about my life. And then I realised that at the same time, Edward Said was writing about Mansfield Park and pointing out that there was this undercurrent discussion about slavery, which would have made it really interesting to us. But none of our teachers pointed out Edward Said. And, you know, I went through my entire education and studied my first brown writer in my final term of university. No brown teachers at all, and no historical figures of colour, apart from Martin Luther King for half a week and Gandhi for half a week. That was it.
Yeah.
I mean, all the other brown people were murdered slaves or conquered people in India. That's it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you can feel that that resonates with so many people who are educated in the British education system over the last decades. But it seems like for you, going to Amritsar and Punjab to do the documentary that you did about the Amritsar massacre and about Jallianwala Bagh, I mean, that's one of the places where you start in the book. Was that a revelatory moment?
I basically realised that the average Indian on the street knew a lot about British Empire, and I knew embarrassingly little. And one of the things about empire, one of the legacies, is that we tell ourselves in Britain that we have the best education system in the world. And I was told that all the time, and I went to a school which had some of the best exam results in Britain. I went to a university which was named the best university in the world. So you walk around thinking, God, I'm educated. And then you get to the age of 40 and you go to Amritsar, and you realise you know much less than the average man on the street. So I just began filling the gaps in my own education, really. And it became a book by accident, really.
There's a lovely quote in it where you say, "I feel like I'm decolonising myself," and it's
I feel like that. I feel like that's a long process as well. And I think as a nation, we're doing it in a very dysfunctional way, but we're beginning to do it.
And then within that also, there's your own Sikhism and coming from a Sikh family, and the fact that there's a very particular history that the Sikhs have in the British imperial story, which on the one hand is one of sort of martial loyalism and being part of the armies, of suppressing 1857, and on the other hand it's one of great resistance and rebellion, and you reflect on that in the book. But do you want to say a bit more about that?
That was endlessly surprising, realising that, you know, the entire self-image of the Sikhs was shaped largely by the British, because we see ourselves as a martial race. Not that you can tell that from my physique. That was created by the British. I didn't have any idea. I didn't know the Sikhs took the side of the British at the mutiny. I didn't know there were Sikh soldiers amongst those shooting at Jallianwala Bagh. I mean, that's quite a difficult thing to face up to. But also, I didn't know there was massive resistance. Was it Gaddar movement? Gaddar movement?
Yeah, the Gaddar movement.
Yeah, and I didn't know about that either. So it's been an incredible education. Everything about my life can be explained by British Empire. The reason I'm here. And yet I knew nothing about it, or very little, beyond that scene in Gandhi. You know.
But that's what comes across in the book, is that journey of discovery. And I mean, how has that changed? I mean, has that changed everything for you then? How you think about Britishness as well? I mean, has that changed?
Yeah, it has, pretty much. Yeah, it's changed a lot of what I think about Britain and my role in it. It reflects the way I feel about museums, multiculturalism, the Windrush scandal, Stephen Lawrence, our post-war history, the NHS, which was, I realised in the middle of the pandemic, is staffed by 44% BME people. You know, that's a legacy of empire. So it's everywhere in this country. It's in our language, our politics, Brexit, the imperial nostalgia of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. And yeah, it's absolutely everywhere, isn't it? Once you start seeing it, you can't talk about anything else.
It's a bit like that scene in Goodness Gracious Me where they say everything's Indian.
Yeah, Indian.
You start to say everything's imperial, but it's true. I mean, we play this game in my family where you only have to go to a stately home, and it doesn't take 5 minutes before you start to see something that's
the
imperial.
The Jubilee. You realise how Indian the royal family are, because they live together in a big house. You know, they're really into arranged marriages. Apparently, the Queen really likes Tupperware boxes, which my mom's really into as well. But as we know, there's a real imperial connection to the royal family. I mean, Queen Victoria speaking Hindi. Was it Hindi or learning Urdu?
Yes, she was learning Urdu.
She had a servant
Yeah.
who was Indian. She was really into being Empress of India. Interestingly, she was Empress of India and not Empress of the Empire. I find that very interesting. But yes, sorry, I've gone off subject.
No, but that's what comes across in the book, is how you are unpicking how far empire is present in places that we might not have naturally thought it to be present. So it's there. It's in botanic gardens. It's there in museums. It's
Actually, you mentioned something interesting there, Botanic Gardens, which I
Yeah.
more or less forgot to mention. But I'm like, nice sequel gives me an excuse to go into
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But oh my God, Botanic Gardens, do people realise? I've been to Kew Gardens loads of times and just see it as a nice place to see some nice plants, take my mother along, see the roses, and that's where Britain spread all these plants and helped make Sri Lanka into a tea colony and discovered a major cure for malaria. And I didn't realise it was so colonial.
And it's moving away from that idea of colonialism just as something violent, I suppose, as well, which seems to dominate some of the popular kind of conceptions of empire. Because what you're showing is the motivations for empire are much more nuanced than that. There's
Yeah.
exploration.
But we were talking about this earlier, about a question that always comes up is, was empire good or bad? And I address this repeatedly in the book. And it's a question I get asked about most, and you get asked about it a lot by your students and other people. And it's not a question I think you can really give a straight answer to, because if you're interested in history, you want to understand it. You don't want to measure it. It's not like a bottle of water you're giving a review to on the Boots website or something, But that is the way the British talk about empire. And it's really dysfunctional. And I'm actually not doing events this year, apart from this one, because William Dalrymple blackmailed me into doing it. But I don't do them because whenever I found I came out and did them, I always get a couple of white men, actually sometimes Indians, in their 70s, who shout at me, who say, "You're a disgrace, why are you doing down British history? You should be more grateful for what this country has given you." And it's like, that's not the way history works, man. I'm just trying to understand it. Everyone should be trying to understand it. And I feel the same about people who just want to say empire was nothing but evil. Empire, like all history, is complex. You need nuance. But you don't need to try to come to the weird balance. And this whole balance sheet is stupid.
It is very strange how this whole balance sheet seems to dominate ideas of imperial history in a way that it wouldn't if you were doing sort of medieval Avignon or something. Nobody wants to, in other historical subjects, make you weigh up, was it good or bad? But there's always this question.
In general, you shouldn't
constantly.
compare empire to Nazism, but
Yeah.
I would say, but would you say, was the Holocaust good or bad? Were the Nazis good or bad? Was Mussolini good or bad? You wouldn't say that. But literally, some exam boards in this country are setting that as a question in 2022. It's really deeply dysfunctional.
And then you also wrote about how if you don't celebrate empire, then you can also be coded as anti-British. That there's a sort of sense that you're not patriotic if you don't celebrate, or if you start to pick apart empire or even talk about it, critique it.
If you
might
do
be
down
actually
British history. And it's our government have been doing that. This government and certain ministers have been going around saying, we're going to remove funding from museums who engage trustees who talk about negative aspects of our British history. And it's like, that is literally what's happening in Russia, and it's so terrible, but it seems to be actual government policy. And they basically can't end soon enough, in my opinion.
But you seem to have been... I'm not going to stop the applause. But, I mean, you seem to have managed to steer a very careful course through these culture wars. And I'm quite intrigued by how you've managed to do that. And I think it's because you're committed to really telling the nuanced detail of the history and weighing it up and showing how complicated it is, rather than emphasising one side or the other.
Well, I'm glad you say that. I do feel like I have. But many thousands of people would disagree. Because lots of people think I've been too mean about empire. And there's loads of people on the left who think I've been too lenient on empire. But I'm basically a centrist dad, I'm one of the many centrist people in this country who like to be in the middle. I think it helps that I work at the Times. So I think I can get away with saying things that other people will be shut down for being woke. But I think that sort of helps.
But I also read in it that there's a kind of commitment there to a form of patriotism almost, that like actually it's because you care about this country that you want to understand this history. And you say if we don't confront the reality of what happened in the British Empire, we'll never be able to work out who we are or what we want to be. And that's something that really, I think, we can see with Brexit, also with questions around Scottish devolution and what's happening in Ireland. There's a lot of questions at the moment in Britain about who we want to be, what British nationalism is, how we kind of cohere and pull this country together.
Yeah.
And I felt like that seemed to be running through the book, that there's that question is an important one for you.
Hopefully you can read the book and think, I'm really proud of being British. I really am. It's just that a certain type of Britishness has been adopted by this government. And I'm very much of the Britishness that was being celebrated at the 2012 Olympics. That was a form of Britishness, wasn't it? And now we've got another kind of Britishness. But each type of Britishness tries to make out that the other doesn't exist. And that's the problem. But I'm glad you can read the book and realise I don't hate Britain. And actually, it's because I love this country and I'm grateful for everything that I want to make it better, that I want us to be less dysfunctional about our history.
So it's sort of by dealing with these amnesia and these gaps and the things that have been forgotten and not talked about that we can actually kind of somehow bring people together. Is that what you think?
Yeah, I think this history ultimately could bring us together, because if you look at our imperial history, what we are basically is we're British Asian as a nation. India was so important. It was the key aspect of imperialism. And if you think about that, basically we've been British Asian as a country for hundreds of years. And there's lots of British Asians here. That's a positive thing. It's something that links us all together. And there are terrible things that happen. But even in a family history, there's terrible things that happen in your family history. It doesn't mean you hate your mother or father, Just shit happens, right? We just need to understand it.
And that kind of link between imperial history and migration histories and the arrival of British Asians and British black people and people from across the empire seems to... That's another unique aspect, I think, of what you're doing, because you're making that connection. There's that famous phrase, we're here because you were there, which is there as one of the chapter headings, which comes from a former director of the Institute of Race Relations. But that kind of link between empire and then the migration story is a really
I think that's a positive story.
Strand.
I think most British people think it's positive. The problem is there's also a deeply negative aspect of it, which is racism. I argue in the book that we have a particular brand of racism in this country which goes straight back to empire. You can see the attitudes just continuing. And you've got to remember things like basic things like there was a colour bar in Wolverhampton until the mid-80s in some pubs, The royal household did not employ brown or foreign people until 1966. Things like that reveal that we do... British Empire was white supremacist, and we've inherited those attitudes, as well as the multiculturalism. You can't separate the two things, I think.
But I wonder, if this is if you feel that you're actually just sometimes, are you winning people over, or are you preaching to the converted? Are there, because there's a lot of people here who might agree with you, and I
think about that a lot, actually, because and actually I think it's a combination. Sometimes I'm just talking to people who agree with me. I suspect this audience probably agree with me, but then I do events in very white parts of the country where you have real hostility. And actually, you know what? It's not easy writing about empire in the Times of London. I get a lot of shit and a lot of abuse and a lot of racism, which William Dalrymple has very kindly spoken out about, because he's been writing similar stuff to me for decades, and says he's never once had a letter of the kind I get every week telling me to F off, And I think that reveals something about how much in denial we are about this history and the racism of it.
And they're still coming, those letters? You're still getting that?
Yeah, they're quite persistent. They tend to increase when you appear on TV or when you're in the newspaper, yeah.
And always letters, for some reason.
Yeah.
Why not emails?
I think you can't find my email online.
That would be
that's
right.
why.
Yeah.
So they write, and if you send a letter to me at the Times, it eventually gets to me. Yeah.
So you can send some some different
Yes,
sorts of letters.
Yeah, send me some crap in the post. Not literally.
No.
Um,
But there are, I mean, because however sort of carefully we try and tread through this, there are some episodes in the book that are really dismal, shocking stain on the British record, and Tasmanian history, for instance, in there.
and shockingly, it was a genocide. And
It's unbelievable, and the way you write about it.
You knew about
I
that,
did
right?
know about it, but I thought the way that you wrote about it made it real. For instance, calling it Tasmania, not Van Diemen's Land. I mean, it kind of created an immediacy, and also because you use the first names of people rather than their surnames. You know, there's something about it that made it very real, that genocide, which wiped out the Tasmanian population, and there's these stories of people walking around with bits of earlobes and kind of body parts that they've used
I think a woman had her partner curled in front of her. The man was then decapitated, and she was made to wear his head as a necklace. You know, but I think it's really important to bring that stuff alive, because you know what? In this country now, we've got Tasmanian genocide denial. I don't want to mention the historian's name. Well, actually, he's not a historian, an academic figure who's been arguing that the Tasmanian genocide didn't happen. And that's the level of the lack of knowledge in this country, that someone can say that. I mean, I didn't read a single book, even the more right-wing ones, including, I think, Paxman and Niall Ferguson. None of them denied the Tasmanian genocide. And yet, it's happening in our mainstream press. So I think that's so shocking.
And it seems to me, you know, some of the more shocking episodes in the book, like the Tasmanian genocide, Mau Mau, that happened in Kenya in 1950s, where torture was demonstrably used against the local population and has been upheld in courts.
And very recent.
And very recent, and also was being hidden from memory through the disposal of archives that weren't donated to the National Archives as they should have been at that time.
And we were having anti-black racism on our streets in Britain at exactly the same time.
So at the same time.
Yeah.
But some of those episodes aren't South Asian. And we're here at Jaipur Literature Festival in India. And I don't want to do myself out of a job because I'm a historian of South Asia as well. But it sometimes feels to me like the South Asian story has dominated our imperial history, because there's such an affection and attachment to India, and so many people have had a contact with India and been to India on holiday, and we have that mutual shared history, that sometimes we forget these other episodes that have happened in other places.
Yeah,
too.
I really wanted to connect the West Indian, Caribbean history to the Eastern, because I find that the historians separate themselves, don't they, really? And actually, it was separate. The two issues were separated in Britain when the people came over, when the planters made a load of money in the Caribbean, and when the people from the East India Company made a load of money. You know, they concealed their wealth. Some of them did. I think there's a weird paradox where people who'd made their money from slavery were more open about it than East India, because India was seen like the modern-day equivalent of being a Russian oligarch, whereas the upper classes could understand plantation slavery because it involved land. You know, they could get it.
Yeah.
So it's a weird contradiction where they conceal the Indian history more than they conceal the slavery history.
But it seems to me we almost need a kind of connected history of empire for it to make sense. Because if we just look at one bit, if we just look at slavery, we just look at the British in India, it doesn't quite join up. And you have to see these things in circulation. I mean, you have to imagine that people...
Totally, but it gets even more dysfunctional, because, I mean, I went back to my old school and asked them what they were learning, and some of the kids came away with the idea that slavery was something that just happened in America, that we weren't really involved in it. And so I think that the levels of ignorance are profound. So we've got to start at a very basic point.
Yeah, I think somewhere in the book you say something as if, you know, Britain carries on as if slavery was nothing to do with us, as if it wasn't actually happening here, because it was geographically located in the Caribbean.
That Eric Williams quote where he says, the way the British talk about slavery, it's almost as if they only went into it so they could have the satisfaction of abolishing it. You know, that's the way we talk about slavery, right?
Yeah.
We just congratulate ourselves. We don't remember the 3 million slaves we transported across the Atlantic and how we led the industry for, I think, more than a century, right?
Yeah, and I was talking earlier to Chris Manjapra about what happened during emancipation, so-called, when there were all these reparations being paid across the empire to former slaveholders as well, which is a huge story. So there's so many kind of different connections and stories there.
That, I mean, paying £20 million to the slave owners, unbelievable. We already stopped paying it off in 2015. But then, I don't know if you guys remember this, but the UK Treasury tweeted saying, "Hooray, we've paid this off. Aren't we great?" And it's like, hold on, we're congratulating ourselves for paying money to very rich people for enslaving black people hundreds of years ago. Well done. It's really dysfunctional.
And while we're on that, let's talk about statues a bit, because you're a bit in the book. You sort of say, "I'm not really." There's been so much controversy, hasn't there, about Colston's been thrown in the water in Bristol and pulled down, and then the Rhodes in Oxford has been a point of contention for years now. The commemoration there of Rhodes, but I get the impression you say at some point you're not. It bothers you walking past Clive in London.
Clive, I wouldn't mind if someone dragged Clive down. It could be Rishi Sunak, who looks at it every day.
Yeah.
It's right outside his office. But equally, basically the statue thing happened just as I was finishing the book, and my editor was like, "You should write a chapter on statues." And I started to, and I was like, you know what? I don't care, ultimately. There's just street furniture. We haven't noticed it until recently. Compared to racism, politics, multiculturalism, our wealth, it's not that much of a legacy. My preferred solution is once a year, everyone gets a box of tomatoes, and you can pelt the statue you hate the most with tomatoes, and then you're not accused of deleting history, and people learn about these historical figures. I think they do something similar in Spain, don't they?
Yeah.
Obviously, we'd have to keep in mind food waste. That'd be terrible. But Gary Young says that we should tear down all statues because they're all crap. I've got some sympathy for that as well. But ultimately, I don't think they're interesting. But they've created debates which are quite interesting.
But are those debates really getting to the question? Because there's in a way they're becoming a proxy for something else. They're becoming a proxy for British politics, for kind of left, right, culture war. Yeah, I'm trying to avoid using the phrase culture war, but ultimately we have to say it, don't we? That it's become a proxy for a different kind of discussion that doesn't seem to really be about.
No, it's not.
About empire.
It's not about history or anything. My favourite thing is the sillier things that happened around that debate. So I remember when everyone was attacking these statues, but also people were protecting them. So the far right started appearing to guard statues around Britain, and a bunch of far right people turned up to guard the statue of George Eliot in Nuneaton, the novelist, who was anti-slavery and massively spoke out about anti-Semitism. And they had no idea she was, but they were guarding it anyway. And then we had the Culture Secretary, Oliver Dowden, who's no longer Culture Secretary. He said he was going to tie himself to the statue of Nelson in Trafalgar Square to stop woke people tearing it down. And no one's threatened the statue of Nelson. No one's serious. Also, I'd like to see him, I'd like to see him tie himself to that statue, But it's just so silly. But that was the level of the conversation, wasn't it?
Yeah, it feels like it can potentially, maybe it gets some people to read up about Clive's story and learn about his kind of rapacious extraction of wealth from India, but actually it doesn't seem like it drives much kind of serious engagement.
No, for my TV thing, I did go and meet a descendant of Clive and met him at the statue of Clive in Shrewsbury, and I expected him to be very defensive, but he was like, "God, I hate this statue, I wish they'd tear it down." The guy was a complete arsehole. And
not the guy you met.
Thank you for legal reasons.
Just being clear.
He was lovely. He looked like Santa Claus, literally. But yeah, I love when things like that happen, when you get complexity rather than the basic kind of thing.
And perhaps one of the most complex things that you really do seem to get very involved with. There's this idea of restitution in museums and how those things. I know you went up to Aberdeen and met the museum director there, where they've done quite a lot of work of taking human remains back from that museum.
The level of conversation about reparations in this country are very. I guess we're talking about museums here rather than slavery reparations. Is very basic, and even if the British Museum returned all of the contested items that are contested, it would still have 99.9999% of its collection. And only 1% of his collection is on display. And actually, I met George Osborne recently, who's the new chair of the British Museum, and he said, I've read your book, Satnam, and I saw that figure about 99% of the collection being in storage. And he said, it's not really fair, because, some of those items are really small.
Did he say that?
I was like, well, the Kohinoor diamond's really small. What do you mean? And some of those items are human remains. That I didn't really appreciate until I saw some of them. No one even knows they're there, and our museums have them in storage.
Yeah, that idea that it's not really the value in a material sense. It's not that some of them might be very valuable, like the Kohinoor, but it's actually the value that they have to the people. I think at one point you say something about it's like Napoleon taking Stonehenge and putting it in Lille or something. And you feel that these are things that just have very deep symbolic
these are
meaning.
Things which explain who these people are. So if you're a member of the Australian Aboriginal people, and you see the shield that the first Aborigine that Captain Cook met was holding, that means something, because he wiped a load of those people out. Now there's so few of them. That shield means a lot to them. And yet, it's in a corner of a cupboard in the British Museum, probably not even displayed sometimes, And I feel like the stuff that made me angry in relation to the Sikhs was the stuff taken out of Ranjit Singh's, treasury, the Kohinoor diamond. Yeah, I don't think that matters as much as the fact that Ranjit Singh had the galgi of Guru Gobind Singh, the feather that the Guru wore in his turban. I think, God, to see that, and there were some relics of the Prophet Muhammad, apparently, lost because the white guys didn't really care about that. It didn't look valuable, and they lost it. That stuff is painful, isn't it? That these people have lost them.
And it's sometimes, even if they stay here and they're on display in British museums, it's the wording in the captions and the way that they're then presented and depicted.
There's
and
so
I
much
think
language, isn't there?
Yeah.
It often says, this shield or this boomerang was presented to John Cook. And it's like, I don't think it was presented. He might have shot the owner.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it was probably stolen.
Yeah.
But that's why, Black Panther, the film, is great. Have you seen it? 9th most viewed film of all time.
Oh.
And there's a scene where one of the black heroes goes into the British Museum and says, I'm going to take that. And the curator goes, no, you can't. That's ours. You can't steal it. And it's like, well, you stole it from us. I'm taking it. And I feel that's the attitude amongst young people. The way young people, I think, feel about museums is how our generation felt about zoos. Because I remember going to zoos as a kid and thinking, let them go, man. Why are you sticking a lion in Dudley Castle? It's really cold. But I think young people feel the same about museums.
Yeah. You seem really optimistic about younger people, and you're doing quite a lot of work with younger people. Do you feel that generational divide is very stark in Britain?
It's quite profound, but ultimately, fair to say, we're going to die off, aren't we? So Britain is getting more and more diverse, and it's getting more and more interested in this history. There was a survey done recently which found that 78% of British people, around 78 or 75, thought it was a good idea to teach kids about slavery and colonialism at school. You would never guess that the way the government talk about it. You'd think that people were furious. They didn't want to have this woke history in their face. But I think most people in Britain are interested, and they don't mind. And young people especially don't mind. I think they're going to school and saying, why are you not telling me about Indian history? Why are you telling me about the Tudors for 4 years? And Tolland Man. Remember Tolland Man? A lot of that. So people want a different history.
Yeah, but the appetite is there, and the demand seems to be there. But yet, our government seems to be very determined to sort of not let that happen.
Yeah, I mean,
Why is that?
It's a reaction to Black Lives Matter, and it's a deliberate political strategy because they think it's a way of holding on to voters who voted Conservative but are actually probably Labour voters, so they're, you know, economically left-wing but socially right-wing. They think the flag is cool, they love the Queen, they hate people who are doing down in British history. But I think they're imposing their view of what these people are like, because these are people from my town of Wolverhampton. They're not like that. And I think it's a deliberate culture war which is not going to work. And I think we're seeing it fall apart right now before our eyes.
That's a very encouraging kind of vision.
Except we've got two more years of this insanity.
Yeah. But it's interesting you said that about Wolverhampton, because ultimately a lot of this does come back to Wolverhampton as well.
Everything comes
back to Wolverhampton, doesn't
Everything.
it? It does.
Yeah.
It does seem like that for you is a touchstone of where this you know, there's this massive global empire story, but there's also Wolverhampton at the heart of it.
I guess, I mean, I've written a memoir novel and a history book, and all of them have gone on about Wolverhampton. And I realise there's no appetite in the world for the Wolverhampton trilogy. But I've written it anyway. And I think Wolverhampton's really interesting because it was one of the first places in Britain to experience mass immigration. And so I think, in a way, it went through a load of stuff that the rest of the country went through much later. So I actually think it's a useful place to talk about.
And you've got Enoch Powell right there and all that immigration. So it is a kind of...
Yeah, it's a kind of touchstone.
It's like a touchstone.
A microcosm of the whole nation.
We've got time for a couple more questions, and then before I hand it over to everybody here. But I suppose lots of people will be wondering what you're going to do next now after.
What, today?
Well, that too.
I'm going to have Nando's. Oh, God, I should have something Indian tonight, shouldn't I, in honour of this festival. I'm writing a sequel about how British Empire shaped the planet. That won't be controversial at all. But it's not the Niall Ferguson balance sheet thing. It's about looking at things now, explaining how those things occurred because of empire. So, for example, certain countries will farm just, say, tea plantations, penal colonies. Some of our tax laws go back to empire. The way our NGOs and charities work. Green colonialism. So each of these areas is a kind of a nuclear bomb of controversy. So I'm going to go into hiding as soon as it comes out. And I'm writing a kid's book, but I'm not meant to tell you. Just keep it quiet. Yeah. The kid's version of this.
Wow. Yeah.
I resisted doing it because I didn't want to water down the violence. But apparently kids can take it now. So they're just going to have a load of violence in their books. I think kids think it's quite cool. Well, obviously not cool, but they like to hear about violence.
Oh, are there going to be illustrations in this book?
Yes, I think all kids' books are illustrated. I don't have kids, so I don't know what's normal. But yes, there's going to be illustrations. Yeah.
Sounds
I won't be doing them. Yes, thank God.
That sounds absolutely fantastic, and I think, as you can hear, I think there'll be a lot of appetite for that. So
it's amazing to hear, man, because I find it amazing that kids are going to grow up and have this knowledge that I didn't have until I was in my 40s, because it's changed the way I see everything. I think it would have changed my life if I'd known this stuff, you know, in my teens. And I feel excited for kids, but also I feel really jealous that, you know, we didn't know about. We were endlessly hearing about the Tudors, and which are interesting. I love the Tudors. I mean, my favourite book is Wolf Hall. But do you need to study it for 4 years, you know? When actually British Empire is the biggest thing we ever did as a country. Biggest empire in human history. But yet we study the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, but not the British Empire. It's crazy.
Well, Satnam, I think there's going to be so many questions here from the audience, and I don't want to stand in the way of people being able to ask those questions. So
yes. I'm very happy to answer them, but I am going to say I'm not going to answer any question about whether empire was good or bad. Because I think people ask that question a lot, and what they want from me is they want me to change my answer. You know, I address it in the book, and I think sometimes when people ask the same question again and again, what they want is not an answer, they want obedience. You know, they want their view repeated back to them, and I'm not going to give that. But anyway, ask anything else.
Okay. Should we take 2 or 3 together and then you can answer?
Sprinting to get your questions.
Well, thanks very much for that. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I'm sorry to say that I haven't read it.
It's all right, it's not compulsory.
Okay. Well, I thought it might be being here. But anyway, I'm glad you mentioned immigration towards the end of the conversation, because that's really quite a, I don't know if it is in your book and in any substantial way, because that really is about a denial of links with the colonies. And you were talking about brutality, and I just wanted to point your attention to a really brutal episode of British immigration where Asian women were subjected to virginity testing because on the basis of our patriarchal values were being turned against us as a community, that if you were coming here for a genuine arranged marriage, you would be a virgin and therefore you were subjected to virginity testing. And that's in my lifetime. And I sort of still shudder to think about, it's not even something that goes back before I was born. And
it's the 70s. I do actually talk about it in the book.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
okay,
and,
great. So sorry about that.
I found out about it. I think you've written about this as well, I think. I've talked to you about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's shocking. And it happened in the 70s. And that's when my mum was coming to Britain, and the idea that might have happened to her. But those are colonial attitudes, because British people thought Indian women, they don't have sex, so therefore that's an easy way of working out whether they're genuine or not. But yeah, unbelievable, and not that long ago.
79.
Yeah, 79.
Yes. Hi, so I'm an American writer, and I moved here just a year and a half ago. And so in the US, we focused all this conversation around colonialism and slavery only on America. We actually don't learn anything about anybody else. But one of the things in the US is the Black Lives Matter movement, which you've mentioned, which started in 2012 but took global stage in 2020. I'm curious how that movement has influenced your decolonization journey, and then maybe broadly the decolonization journey of Britain.
Thank you, very good question. And I've been thinking a lot about the American connection to British Empire because I've been writing an introduction to my American edition. And I think there's a view in America that they rejected all things to do with British Empire when they had the American War of Independence, But they forget America was created by British Empire. Those slaves didn't end up there spontaneously. The British were involved in getting them there, were among the powers that got them there. The British used the cotton way past abolition to fund the industries. I think there's a deep connection between America and British Empire. And actually, in the late 19th century, there was this incredible movement to kind of bring these people like H.G. Wells and Andrew Carnegie were obsessed with tying Britain and America together. They wanted Britain and America to become this Anglo-Saxon super race. And so I think there's deep connections. And I've forgotten what your question was. Oh yeah, Black Lives Matter. I mean, Black Lives Matter happened towards the end of my book when I was just finishing it. It was amazing when I was just about to finish it, and there was a leading item on the 10 o'clock news about the ways in which colonialism has shaped racism in America. And I was like, oh my God, it's so odd when you're writing something really seemingly obscure, when your friends don't understand what you're doing, and suddenly it's the biggest story in the world. So I think it probably shaped more the reaction to my book. That's probably why so many people read it, rather than what I wrote about, because I've written it already. And I wrote it mainly for myself. Thank you for your question. Got there eventually.
Hi, Satham. First, I want to acknowledge what you said about the complexities of empire. I'm ethnically Indian from Malaysia. I would not exist if not for colonialism, because I'm Tamil, Telugu, Malay, people who would not have come together in India in the context of the caste system, of geography and all that, but because of indentured slavery, here I am. I think, and that relates to my next question, in terms of, I think in the discourse surrounding colonialism in Britain, I found my country's experience isn't really reflected in indentured slavery. The fact that Indians were brought over to different parts of the world, and Indians, for example, in Malaysia, 7% of the population, lower social mobility, still in rubber plantations. In fact, I think a few years ago, not sure if this is in your book or you're aware, that a bunch of Indians tried to sue the Queen and said, you brought us there, and then you left us there, and you don't even let us come here. I've been thinking, basically, what do you think is the role of modern Britain in sort of addressing this? As a Commonwealth citizen here in the UK, I've checked what are my reparations, what are the privileges I get here. I get to vote in this country, I get to work for the civil service here. There's a special visa that exists for white Commonwealth countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, where you get to work here for 2 years under 30s. Doesn't apply to everybody else. So I think linked to the previous question about immigration laws as well, Britain went overseas, stayed there, now won't let people in as well. So complex question, but basically what do you think is the role of Britain to, right now, in terms of policy and all that, to address the very real inequalities and disparities that exist because of what was
Good
done?
question, and I think what you're pointing out is that our immigration legislation is racist, and it has been. And there's a report came out recently, well, actually it came out only after the government tried to repress it, which found that all our post-war legislation was racist, and it goes back to the whole idea of white men's colonies and brown colonies. But Malaysia is really interesting because I'm writing about it in my new book and writing about indentured labour, right? People don't talk about that very much, and hundreds of millions of people were moved around the world so that the British Empire could produce certain goods in certain areas. And I don't think that's very well understood in the Indian diaspora. I don't think people understand. I didn't understand, like someone like V.S. Nepal has ended up in Trinidad because of indentured labour. I mean, talk about lack of education, but I didn't understand that until about a year ago.
And the extent of out-migration of white British people to Canada and America and Australia. I mean, there was no net migration to this country till the 1990s, which I always find astonishing because we always think of it as an island that people arrived into. But
And
actually
also
the story is one of people from Britain populating the earth.
And also the dominant narrative in our lifetime is that Britain is being invaded by brown people. So that's another way in which we colonise the way we think about this country. But on top of everything else you mentioned, like Malaysia, people don't think about Malaysia, do they? Mm-hmm. I think there's such a focus on India. I think there's a focus on India even during empire. And there's a focus perhaps on slavery in the Caribbean. But we forget about Burma, Malay.
Middle East.
Middle East.
Yeah.
But yes, hopefully I'll answer some of your questions in my new book.
Hello, I'm John Elliott. I'm a journalist. I was in Delhi for many years. A visitor from Delhi a few days ago asked me whether I thought that Britain was ready for a South Asian prime minister. I said yes. He seemed surprised. From your vantage point, what do you think?
Good question. I think Britain was really ready for Rishi Sunak prime minister about 4 months ago.
But he's got no experience.
Sorry?
He's got no experience.
No. There was a scandal. You might have missed it if you don't live in this country. We discovered he turns out he's one of the richest people in Britain. Yes, and wasn't paying taxes or something. And now he's one of the least popular people in Britain. But there was a brief time when I did think we were going to have a South Asian prime minister. I did feel that he was being approached because of who he was and his abilities and not his skin colour, which is something I didn't think would happen in my lifetime. People generally don't mention his Indianness. Do you feel that? Or am I imagining that? I mean, so in that way, I think we've almost becoming post-racial. But I think that's just Asians. I think there's deep anti-black racism in this country. Deep. And it's really prevalent in the media. It's the way the media write about black communities and present black politicians. And you only got to reflect on the fact that Diane Abbott is the most trolled politician in this country, because she's black, basically, and a woman. But thank you. Good question.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, hi Satnam.
Hello.
Rajesh. So, read your book, love it. Senior show on Channel 4, that's also brilliant. We've exchanged some messages on Twitter, actually. So, and I know you think Twitter is a cesspool of activity. I know that. But the main thing I wanted to say was that, I've been a bit of an ardent fanboy of Indian history in the UK. And therefore, colonialism, imperialism, all has a say in that. For me as a person, today in this room, there's you, there's Shashi Tharoor, and there's William Dalrymple. All three of you in the room at the same time. It's one of those three Bollywood star kind of a moment. Right? So, between the three of you, I'd really like to ask you a slightly provocative question, if that's okay. Nuance, you're all nuanced differently, but what's your perspective on how, and nuance is fine, it's great. How do you think your nuance is different from them both?
You know what? I didn't realize Sashi was here, so I'm now really intimidated.
That was the idea. That was the idea.
And delete a few things I said. And William's here. Oh my God. God. Well, I think William. God, I talked about you, William. I didn't realize you're here. I think I've read both books and I admire them a lot. And William is basically responsible for most of my Indian history, and I think he's probably responsible for most of British people's sense of history. I mean, he's the dominant writer of Indian history, and I think he's done great campaigning work in recent years. He's been vocal about the culture war, and Sashi's done amazing work. Your book's great, but also, you've gone viral so many times. So you've done great, provocative work, which has, I think, woken up white British people to Indian history, and I think people have realized just how nostalgic they are when they come across these videos, and because he's so articulate. But I don't think I could have written my book without those two authors in my life. Thank you.
Hi, Satnam, Tulsi here. I have a question, because this term gets thrown around quite a bit. How do you define decolonization? And you mentioned it a little bit in the beginning of the talk as well. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I realize decolonization means very different things to different people. And I probably go for a centrist vision of it. I think you can decolonize curriculums without deleting the canon. I think you can teach Shakespeare, Jane Austen, and you can talk about the imperial themes in both those authors' works. And you can talk about empire at the same time. But also I'm aware that for some people that's a very weak idea of decolonization. Some people think that all museums should be shut down. We should have entirely revolutionized the British canon, literary canon. I probably don't subscribe to that. I'm probably a bit more conservative. Where do you stand on it?
I think I was born the same year as you, and we've had very similar educational experiences as well. So I agree with you in that. And I mean, that's in terms of, for instance, thinking about the Second World War. I mean, we've seen how the First and Second World War can be taught completely differently without actually changing anything that anybody was already being taught. It's just adding nuance and depth and complexity by talking about the contribution of millions of so I'm of the same persuasion, but I think there is a generational difference as well.
Yeah, there is. And I also think, people who have more radical views of decolonization, I really respect them. Someone like Kehinde Andrews, I think it's a really important argument. We need to hear what they say. But I think ultimately, if you're going around saying we need to close every museum, we need to burn the national curriculum to the ground, I think you're not going to get anywhere. And you need to take people with you. And it's a negotiation. Yeah. So I guess I'm quite Blairite without the Iraq War when it comes to decolonization.
Satnam, Yasmin, hi. Anshul here. How do you see the post-colonial conversation in UK compared to other ex-colonial powers, essentially, say, France, etc., all the other in comparison? And if there was any, if you would think there has been any ex-colonial power which could potentially be a model or example of how supposedly truth and reconciliation or whatever should be done in the UK?
Excellent question. There was a survey done recently of Europeans about how nostalgic they were for their empires. And Britain wasn't the most nostalgic. We were the second most nostalgic country in Europe. The most nostalgic were the Dutch. The Dutch are very nostalgic for their empire. There's empire nostalgia in France. There's definitely empire nostalgia in Russia at the moment, And I think Macron, when he came along, actually said some really progressive things. I mean, he was involved in a report about French museums. He was talking about returning stuff. Germany recently gave $1 billion to Namibia, is that right? I think, and apologized. I don't think any of the former colonial powers are particularly brilliant, but the best example is Germany with its history with World War II, the way in which it confronts it on a daily basis and manages to be proud of itself without basically still acknowledging terrible things were done. So there's a great book called Learning from the Germans by Susan Neiman, and she compares Germany to America and its history of slavery and just points out how amazing Germany is compared to America. So I think that's the example, although Germany has its own problematic colonial history, which it probably hasn't confronted in the same way. Thank you.
Hi. Hi. I'm Radhika. I was just wondering, I heard some people mention post-colonial, post-imperial. Do you think we have passed the age of imperialism, or do you think there are still empires today, and if yes, which ones?
Absolutely, there are empires, and I really recommend the book and The New Age of Empire by Kahinda Andrews. And he argues that America basically continued the traditions of British Empire in a different form. And he argues the United Nations, a lot of the World Bank, they're basically imperial. And something I've been looking into recently for my new book is the way in which NGOs repeat, imperial tropes in the way they deal with Africa. How I didn't come across the idea that when it comes to environmental campaigning, we're imposing a Western view of the environment onto Africa. Why aren't they allowed to develop their countryside in the way we developed our countryside? And stuff like that blows my mind. And I think writers like Kahinda Andrews are so important. But I think you definitely can spot the traditions in not only American empire, but in Russian empire and in the new superpowers.
I think we have to draw it to a close there, although I know that there will be other questions in the audience. And many people will already have Empire Land or have read it, but if you haven't, it will be there in the bookshop. Thank you very much, Satnam Sanghera.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you.